Welcome back to Carolina Journal Radio. I'm Donna Martinez. Who will be North Carolina's next head of public schools? Well, the field is now set, and either Democrat Jen Mangrum or Republican Catherine Truitt will be elected by North Carolina voters in November. But beyond who will lead the Department of Public Instruction, what impact will they actually have, and what should they try to pursue? For that, we turn to Dr. Terry Stoops. He is Vice President of Research, also the Director of Education Studies for the Locke Foundation. Terry, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
First of all, let's talk about the two candidates a bit. Tell us first about Democrat Jen Mangrum.
And Dr. Mangrum is a professor at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and her specialty is reading research, and she has been a professor there for some time. She's a former public school teacher, and she ran unsuccessfully against Phil Berger for his state Senate seat 2 years ago. So that's really where she came on the scene, and she has beat out the field of Democratic opponents to be their candidate for superintendent.
On the Republican side, the candidate who won the primary is Catherine Truitt. Tell us about Catherine Truitt.
Catherine is the chancellor at Western Governors University, North Carolina. That's an online university, a fairly new one here in the state. She's a former classroom teacher, also former advisor to Governor Pat McCrory. So she has been in North Carolina policy circles for a few years, stepped out for a short while, serving in her capacity as chancellor, and is now back on the scene.
Let's talk about what will come once one of those two women is elected in the fall. There has been conversation for years. You and I have talked about it on this program. You've written extensively about it. The issue of the murkiness of how public education is actually governed in North Carolina. So this is a statewide elected office, Superintendent of Public Instruction. How much influence and power does that office and the person who holds it actually have?
Well, no one really knows, and that really is the problem, is that there have been numerous proposals to turn this into an appointed position, either appointed by the General Assembly or the governor, or even members of the State Board of Education, as a way to try to get a little more idea of who is ultimately accountable for public schools. But it's a statewide elected position with two primary functions. The first is to serve as the secretary of the State Board of Education. That's a non-voting role, essentially, as an advisor to the State Board of Education. And just as a reminder, the State Board of Education is a 11-member appointed board, along with the lieutenant governor and the treasurer, and they're appointed by the governor. But their most important function is as head of the Department of Public Instruction. That's the large education agency that oversees a lot of the implementation of programs that are approved by the General Assembly or regulations that are approved by the State Board of Education. So that is the most important function of the superintendent, is to oversee that agency. And doing so also gives them quite the soapbox. The media always seeks out the superintendent, and when there are opportunities to weigh in on certain policy matters. And so the superintendent definitely has a very visible role in the media.
That is fascinating, because your description implies that it's really an administrative office in terms of running the operations of the Department of Public Instruction, which is a vast, big agency, but yet it's a non-voting member of the Board of Education, which sets policy. So does that make then for kind of a rough relationship, so to speak?
Well, it certainly has, as long as Mark Johnson was the superintendent of public instruction, and Mark decided not to run for re-election and instead vied for the lieutenant governor nomination on the Republican side and did not do so successfully. There was a contentious relationship between Mark and the members of the State Board of Education, so much so that they went to court to sort it all out. And unfortunately, the courts didn't give us much of an answer about who is ultimately responsible for some of the functions in public schools. It did clarify a few of the human resources issues that were at issue between the superintendent and the State Board of Education. But shortly after the courts released their decision about the lawsuit, basically both sides declared victory. And that's how we knew that we really hadn't gotten any answers about whether there was any clarity about who was in charge, because both the superintendent and the chair of the State Board of Education said the courts basically said that we won. And so we're still stuck in ground zero, basically, as far as trying to determine who exactly is in charge of North Carolina public schools.
Fair to say, then, that the relationship that the superintendent develops with those members of the State Board of Education is really critical as to whether or not the person who is the superintendent actually has an impact on policy decisions?
Well, it doesn't need to be an amicable relationship because if the superintendent believes that the state board is acting incorrectly, they should speak up. And in fact, one of the things that I've criticized the State Board of Education for, and this has been happening for decades, is that everyone seems to agree on every issue, and all the votes seem to be unanimous, and no one speaks up and objects to some of the policies that are proposed. And Superintendent Johnson was willing to do that. And although he was criticized for that, I see that as a very positive thing, because we should have voices of dissent, especially when there are important issues at stake. And of course, the public schools are a 1.5 million student system, and there, of course, are tremendously important issues at stake. And so I really do applaud Superintendent Johnson for speaking up when he found that the State Board of Education was perhaps not acting in the best interests of children.
Okay, Terry, so I'm going to give you a bit of power here as you and I are talking. Let's say that you have been chosen to be the host and moderator of a debate between the two candidates for the superintendent's position. That would be the Democrat, Jen Mangrum, and the Republican, Catherine Truitt. What would be a key question that you would ask both of those candidates?
Well, I would definitely start with school choice, because Dr. Mangrum has made it clear that she is not necessarily a fan of private school choice or charter schools. And so as the head of the Department of Public Instruction, which has the responsibility of overseeing North Carolina's charter schools, I would like to know what she plans on doing with that office to basically fulfill the duties of oversight for the state's charter schools. So that would definitely be one. Teachers, how she plans on making the profession of teaching through the Department of Public Instruction more attractive to basically those who are in universities and from out of state. So I think I would probably start with those two issues. Any
particular issue or question that you would ask Catherine Truitt, who is the Republican candidate? Anything that perhaps she has written about or talked about that has piqued your interest?
Yeah, definitely what she plans on doing in reforming the state's Read to Achieve program. This is the third grade reading proficiency a program that has seen better days, that has been under fire for many years. She has talked about reforming the implementation of that program, and I'd be very interested to hear what she has to say about that and what her plans are for reform within the Department of Public Instruction.
And I know that going forward, you will be writing a lot about these different policy issues as we find out more and more about these two candidates and where they would see to take the state should they be elected the next superintendent of public instruction. Again, the two candidates that have been determined in the primary going forward for the general election, Democrat Jen Mangrum and Republican Catherine Truitt. Terry Stoops, you can read all of his work at johnlocke.org. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.